It's January 12th, 2026, and welcome back to the Kriya Yoga Podcast, Infinite Season, Episode 14. As you know, 2026, this year, the Kriya Yoga Podcast, as well as the Kriya Yoga Online Ashram, our goal is to provide material, contemplative exercises and practices to encourage your own direct experience of samadhi. Now, there are many things we can talk about as it relates to yoga traditionally, which helps to encourage this experience of samadhi, this experience of oneness, this experience of clarity. But my goal today is to talk about a more modern process. And I found that this process opens up so much energy within our being that it makes our meditation more effective. I'm sure that many of you who are listening are already skilled meditators. And I know many of you already have a deep sense of connection to divinity. But I'm speaking today to those of you who might be struggling, to those of you who might be trying to make your meditation work, or those of you who read these inspiring stories of yogis or great saints or spiritual masters, and you would like to know what they know. You would like to have that sense of faith that they have because of their experiences within their spiritual practice. So I'd like you to imagine with me, imagine that when you sit to meditate, it is easy, it is enjoyable, you look forward to it. It's not a chore in any way. Also imagine that when you sit to meditate or engage in prayer, that you are actually filled with a sense of inner well-being, a sense of divine communion, a sense of being a part of, engaged with, interacting with something greater than yourself, which we'll call divine. That when you meditate, you are filled with the light of divinity, or you are filled with a sense of peace and well-being, or as you go about your day, there is a sense that you are supported in this life, that the experiences you have, that they are not meaningless, random acts of nature. They're part of a grand design. Imagine if you could feel that, if that was your everyday reality. So if you can imagine it, let's wonder, well, how is it possible? Well, it's possible in many ways. You learn to meditate, you learn to take care of yourself, you manage the drama within your life, you encourage a sense of psychological well-being. If you are able to do that, you will find that these things occur more easily. But some of you might have found that no matter how consistently you meditate, no matter how much faith you put in your spiritual path, no matter how hard you try, there's still some struggle, or you might even feel like you're faking it, or you might even wonder about these other people who say that they do experience those things. You wonder, are they even telling the truth? So what do we do if we find ourselves in a situation like this? All right. Well, many of you know who've been listening for a while, you remember that I have a pretty serious fetish with psychological well-being, counseling, and so on. And I get criticized about that. Sometimes people will write to me and say, oh, you just need to have more faith in God. Okay, that's fine. But what I found in my own life, and in the lives of many people that I work with as students, is that all the faith in God in the world doesn't make a difference unless we have an undercurrent of psychological well-being, stability. And that is the case because even though divinity, God, or Divine Mother is all around us, is ever present with us, sometimes we're not able to see it or feel it or believe it. And it's been my experience that the reason that is the case is because the part of us, our field of being, is almost like it is at odds with itself, even fractured. And what I've noticed is that if we can begin to attend to that fracture, if we can begin to resolve or reconcile those different parts of us which are at odds with each other, meditation happens more naturally, and even that sense of divine communion, and not even a sense of divine communion, but the reality of divine communion becomes more apparent to us. And one of the best methodologies that I have found to help encourage that is the internal family systems process. Some of you might already be familiar with internal family systems. I wasn't for a long time. In fact, I was told about internal family systems through a YouTube comment on one of my YouTube videos. Someone said, you should check out the book No Bad Parts. And I actually got that book and I started to read through it. And as I read through it, I thought to myself, oh, I'm not that messed up. I don't need this stuff. So I just closed it and I put it away. Because it all really sounded kind of crazy to me, which is odd considering the vocation that I'm in. But about a year later, I decided I'm going to give that a shot. I want to check into that a little bit more. And so I ended up getting the audio book. And for some reason, the audio book of No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz sat with me a little bit better, mainly because there were guided meditations in it that I could practice. And when I experienced the guided meditations, I began to see, oh, this is why this is so important. And I realized that this judgment I had about talking to yourself and talking to your parts and so on, while that seemed a little crazy to me, and like I didn't really need to do that, as I went through the process, I started to recognize the importance of it. And I started to recognize that the system itself is a very meditative process. And I actually began to incorporate rather extensive time periods of meditation where I would go through the processes of internal family systems as I understood it through this book, No Bad Parts. And at the time, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't expecting some radical shift in my understanding of my spiritual life. I felt very fortunate and content into what I was experiencing and what I knew, spiritually speaking. But the more I engaged internal family systems, the more I realized how much more fullness of energy, expansiveness I had in my meditation. And I also began to recognize an even greater sense, again, of communion, divine communion. And really what I want to get at today, I guess more than anything, is this capacity to experience divine communion. And this is important for our emphasis this year, 2026, the year of Samadhi, because in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we have these three pillars of Kriya Yoga. And one of them is Ishvara Pranidhana, which is translated often as surrender to God, surrender to the divine, or devotion to a higher being. And it's said in the Yoga Sutras that it's through Ishvara Pranidhana, this surrender, this devotion, this what I feel more as a sense of communion, that it's through that our meditation practice, our capacity to experience samadhi is perfected. And so it's very important to be able to touch and access a state of communion so that our practice can become perfected, so that we can complete the experience of our spiritual growth. Now, not to get too far off topic here, but some people say, oh, well, the learning is never done. There's never an end to your spiritual growth. Well, I beg to differ. That's a nice sentiment. And yes, I absolutely believe and feel and have seen that the spiritual growth process is a pretty lengthy one. It can probably even go on into several lifetimes, as we know historically. But it has to have an end. Otherwise, systems like yoga and so on would not indicate that there is an end to this process. We want to be free. Just like when we go to meet a doctor or we go to the hospital or we're going to school, we're not going there to be perpetually with the doctor or in the hospital or at school. There is a goal to be free, to be healthy, to be educated, and so on. Well, the same thing can apply to our spiritual practice. We are working towards our own inner freedom. Now let's return to internal family systems and how it can help with a sense of divine communion. Well, first of all, I want to give you a little background about internal family systems. So this was developed in the 1980s by Richard Schwartz. And the general idea is that our minds, our sense of self, has parts. And you know this to be true of yourself. You note it in your language. You say, well, a part of me wants to do this, or a part of me feels that way, or a part of me wants to do this, but I end up doing that. And there is this idea that all the parts of us have a role to play, meaning that the part that doesn't want us to move forward in a certain direction, there is a reason it doesn't want us to move forward in that direction. The part of us that self-sabotages, the part of us that wants to achieve great things, all of these parts have a role to play, and every single one of these parts actually has a positive intention. So what's wonderful about this system of internal family systems is that the general idea is that you are not broken, that all the parts are actually trying to do right by you. It's just that, like normal people, sometimes their intentions are misplaced. Now, there are 3, we'll say maybe 4 parts to pay attention to in this process. There are the managers, and these are the parts of you that try to control things, try to keep you safe. There are the exiles. These are usually the younger parts of you, which are hurt, our child parts, which have been abused, neglected, or traumatized. And those exile parts, they really need some care and attention, but they're scary because if you can remember a trauma that you've experienced, you don't want to go back to, you don't want to touch, you don't want to admit happened. Well, that pain is deep down in there. And these other parts, the managers, they try to manage your life so that you don't disturb that exile. Or there is another part called the firefighter. The firefighter goes to extreme activities in order to make sure that the system is safe as it perceives it. And the firefighter parts, these are the ones that make you go into extreme behaviors, like binge drinking, or going into rages, or even being a shopaholic. Essentially, what's going on there is the system is getting disturbed, and there's a part of you, the firefighters, which says, I'm going to do whatever it takes to bring balance back to this, to help the system feel okay again. Now, we would not agree probably that binge drinking or being a shopaholic or flying into a rage is a good thing. But we have to remember that the system is not necessarily broken, that the part that we call the firefighter is just doing what it knows how to do. And all of these parts have different ages, meaning that maybe there's a part of you which is 13 years old, and maybe there's a part of you which is 48 years old. Well, as you can imagine, the way the 13-year-old might deal with difficulty and trouble might not necessarily be as appropriate as, say, a 48-year-old. So anyway, we're not going to spend this time going into the whole theory of internal family systems. For that, I'd really like to encourage you to read the book No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. But what this system is doing is it is bringing you into contact. It is giving you the capacity to communicate with these different parts of yourself which haven't been functioning in the most effective ways. It's not treating those parts as though they are bad. It's simply trying to communicate with them to find out why they behave that way, and through the process, bring them up to speed into maybe more healthy ways of dealing with things. And then once those parts are integrated and reconciled, they actually work well together like a healthy family. So the idea in internal family systems is that within you, there are all these parts, and they are all part of an internal family. And just like you have a dysfunctional family that doesn't really know how to support itself, well, that often happens with us, inside us. And internal family systems helps to restore that balance. Now, how does this help your spiritual practice? How does this help with a capacity for divine communion? Well, imagine this. Imagine that you're in a family and that there's actually someone in the family which is a divine being, serene, wise, radiant, intelligent, full of love and grace. And now imagine that you are in a house and there's a whole family living there. And there is this divine being, but then there are 14 other parts which are always screaming at each other, always trying to manage each other. In a sense, imagine all these 14 parts vying for attention, making lots of noise, trying to get your attention. And so if you have these 14 parts making all of this noise, it's extremely hard to have a conversation with that divine aspect of yourself. There's just too much noise. And in our meditation process, in our yoga process, really that's what we're doing. We're learning to still the waves of our chitta, the waves of our field of consciousness, so that we can perceive that radiant divine essence. And pranayama, mantra, study of the scriptures all helps with that. But to be fair, as we know, the practice of yoga, as it says in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and now instruction in yoga, the first sutra in Patanjali, what that's saying is this is for someone who is prepared. These other practices, the meditations, the pranayama, the pratyahara, the study of scriptures, and so on. Really, this deeper practice of yoga is for someone who has reconciled these 14 other parts so that the family can be quiet and respectful and actually hear, feel, and sense that divine being within the family. And this is essentially what IFS is doing. One by one, it is allowing an individual to recognize all of these different parts, to find out what do they need to share with you? What's been going on for them? Why do they behave that way? To resolve it. And then recognizing that each of these parts actually has a positive role to play in your life. And if we can simply shift their activity from self-sabotage to support, then when you sit to meditate or when you try to live a spiritual life, you find that it works out because there is harmony. There is direction moving in the same way there is momentum towards success in this regard. One of the fascinating things about internal family systems that really caught my attention was this core state that they call self or self energy. And is this a part? Well, in a way, but it's not a manager, it's not a firefighter, it's not an exile. It's actually that serene, intelligent, wise energy. It's the aspect of you which is calm, confident, curious, centered, creative, playful, adventurous, and stable. And you know you've felt that before, you've experienced that before. There have been times in your life where you felt free, calm, confident, stable, curious, interested in life, adventurous. It's really the sattvic part of yourself, the part which is full of light and wisdom and clarity. It is the part of you which is as close to your divine essence as you can imagine. In fact, it is an expression of that divine essence. And through our spiritual practice, we learn to embody that more and more. But again, I have found that the engagement, the understanding, the theory, the model of internal family systems can really accelerate that process. So how does this play out in your own life and in your own practice? I'll share some examples, my own examples, as well as some examples of students that I've worked with that have found an IFS counselor and worked with that counselor, how they have benefited from it, how it has accelerated and improved their own capacity to experience samadhi and to experience a sense of divine communion. Return to imagining that you are a meditator and you've been meditating a long time. And yet you find that while you do experience a greater peacefulness in your meditation, it doesn't necessarily continue throughout the day. You find that you still get angry, you still get irritated, you're still afraid, you're still depressed. Well, what's happening there? The technique might be just fine, but the technique itself isn't actually addressing the root issue. Your practice is essentially giving you strength to focus and concentrate and to put up walls and push things that are distracting and troublesome within your field of consciousness away, but it's not actually resolving them. And you can get pretty far with that. However, there's a reason that a lot of popular spiritual figures end up getting involved in scandals, or they end up behaving in inappropriate ways. They might be masters of their technique, but there are aspects of themselves, parts of themselves, which they haven't dealt with. And given the right circumstance, that firefighter or that manager is going to break through and cause some problems. So if you're meditating because you experience depression or anger or anxiety or grief, meditation will help to regulate the nervous system so that you can better work through those things. But you have to actually work through those things. If you are anxious, rather than think that there's something wrong with you that you have to meditate away, maybe you're anxious for a very good reason. Maybe there's a part of you which is disassociated from the present moment, which has experienced something in the past that either you're not aware of anymore or is buried down deep, or you just consciously don't want to look at. If that part is within you, it's just like having a hurt child out on the street crying. You hear it crying, you're trying to do your work, and the actual thing to do might be to get up, go outside, move that child from the street, find out why it is crying, and then once the child becomes calm, and you find the parents of that child, you can get back to your work. In a way, I've seen family systems work like this. You have to learn to listen to these parts, to find out, why am I depressed? There is a reason. You don't have to demonize it. You don't have to act like you're a failure because you're depressed. If you are depressed, in my experience, when I have been depressed, when I started to recognize there is a reason for this, I might not know what it is right now. I might not be aware of it, but I can find that out when I did the inner work, the inner research to figure out what part was hurting, what part was lost in the past, and using the approach of internal family systems to address that, what happened? That depression that I was trying to keep away with meditation, with visiting my guru, with going on pilgrimages, that sense of unease that I was trying to keep away, when I figured out what it was and I gave it space so that I could listen to it and hear it, and it found another way to express within my life, a positive way to use that energy, then it didn't get in the way of my meditations anymore. There was a greater sense of freedom and energy within my practice, and I was able to go deeper into the experience. With some of my students, again, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know I talk about psychological well-being a lot. Many of them would say, you talk about this a lot. Why don't you talk more about spirituality? I'm tired of hearing you talk about psychological stuff. Well, those that resisted, when they finally said, all right, Ryan, you've been saying I should go see an EMDR, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing counselor, or an IFS counselor. You said that. I want to give it a shot. When they finally did it, and they stuck with it for a couple months, they came back to me and said, oh, now I see why you said that. I have been meditating for 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, but within this short amount of time, such energy has become freed up. I have developed a greater harmony within myself that when I sit and meditate, now it flows easy. Now those parts of me which were crying out for attention, they're quiet because they're happy, because I've learned to listen to them and to recognize that if there is a part of me that is lost, well, let's go find it and let's figure out what's going on and let's find a way to determine if it was in a healthy space, what kind of energy would it like to positively contribute to my life? When all of that came together, it became much easier to experience the reality of samadhi, the reality of meditation, and ultimately, again, to have the sense of divine communion. Now let's move on to this idea of divine communion. Well, in internal family systems, the general sense is that there are all these parts of us, and they all have a role to play, and we all have different parts, and they're like an inner family, and they can be in harmony. Well, what I found was fascinating was after many years of studying, practicing internal family systems for myself, and I even worked with an internal family systems counselor to make sure I was doing it right for myself. But many years of doing that, when all of those parts became harmonized, reconciled, when they all felt that they were led by the self, when they all felt a sense of deep connection and trust in the self, well, then what opened up was the reality that if there are parts that were hurt, that were having trouble, well, there are also parts of us which are supremely free and divine. As an astrologer, a Vedic astrologer, I would often teach that these planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, in Vedic astrology, they all are divinities. And I would often teach that the planets themselves are really just aspects of who we are. They are parts of us, but they are cosmic parts of us. And in spiritual traditions, we have angels, devas, we have divine beings, we have ascended masters, and so on. I'm not going to get too much into that because you can get kind of goofy with all of that. So we're not going to go too far there. But there is a sense that if there are cosmic parts of us, well, there are also divine parts of us. And if the parts of us which have been hurt and struggling become happy and calm and reconciled, well, then it's like the internal landscape becomes quieter. And then it becomes much easier to hear, to commune with the cosmic and divine parts of us. Now, I want to be cautious as I speak about this because personally, I feel it takes a lot of inner work before this communion is truthful. And what I mean by that is, if a person is struggling, it's very easy to project our unmet needs into fantasy. And so, while it is absolutely possible to recognize communion with these divine parts, we have to be very cautious, and we likely have done a whole lot of personal work and psychological work so that we're not just projecting into a fantasy. So as I speak about this process of internal family systems and its capacity for divine communion, I really mean that you've done a lot of work with this internal family systems and likely worked with a counselor who can help you recognize truth from fantasy, because it's very easy to blur the lines there, especially if we're beginners, if we haven't really developed much discernment in our lives. But I want to talk about it because it will help to really transform your relationship with your spiritual path. Once the internal family system is calm, clear, has a forward momentum, guided by the self, trusting in the self, and you have a stable spiritual practice which guides you inward, hopefully guided by an experienced teacher in the yogic tradition or any tradition, what you find is that when you engage in meditation or prayer, you begin to feel into a field of radiant awareness. And in the yoga tradition, they talk about this as Hiranyagarbha, the great golden womb, the teacher of the ancients, Om. And that experience is transcendental and transformational. In Sri Yukteswar's book, The Holy Science, he talks about that we experience our spiritual baptism by merging in the field of Om, merging in the radiant field of light. And that takes a lot of work. But I want you to imagine that you are now a person in this world who has discernment, who is guided by truth, who is calm, who can easily live by the yamas and niyamas, harmlessness, truthfulness, contentment, non-stealing, conservation of vital forces, purity, and so on. It's natural for you. But when you've got that kind of calmness and that kind of centeredness, and you turn within and you decide that you want to commune with, direct your attention to the reality of Divine Mother, the reality of Ishvara, or if you're a Christian, the field of the Christ consciousness, or any tradition where there is a higher, clearer state of being, you find that now you just step into it. Each day, each minute, each moment of meditation, of prayer, you're able to step into it. And then as you live your life, you find that it is always ever present within your field of awareness. And so you live your life as though that is real, not because someone told you should believe in it, not because you found an Eastern tradition and you hope that it actually works, not because you are a fanatic about your tradition, but because it is as real as knowing that your best friend will help you if you ever need it. Or it is as real as knowing that you have a partner in your life that you can trust and they will do their best for you, for the relationship. So this sense of communion, again, isn't really as though you are seeing all kinds of fantastical images, or now a being shows up and starts having a conversation with you like I'm talking to you now. It is more of a transcendental feeling of communion, support, and guidance. And yes, your spiritual path, your spiritual tradition helps to encourage that. But you can make the most of this life and not struggle through your spiritual practice and your tradition by bringing harmony to your internal state of being. As I've mentioned, I really enjoy eye movement desensitization reprocessing. When you have worked through the traumas of your life, the things that are stuck energetically, psychologically, and that energy is allowed to flow, it becomes easier to walk the spiritual path. If you have conflicts within your consciousness, you have firefighters that you try to do the right thing, but all of a sudden they make you go off on some other direction, which is self-sabotaging. Or you have a manager who tries to make sure you walk the fine line. You have to do it right. You have to do it this way. In a way, it's almost like an obsessive compulsive kind of thing. You have to do it like this, otherwise everything's going to fall apart. Or you have your exiles, those when you freak out, when something happens and all of a sudden you completely break down, or you lose your way, or you feel extremely afraid, or some extreme emotion overtakes you and it doesn't quite make sense with what's going on in the present moment. If those things dominate your experience and you're trying to resolve them through your spiritual path, that will help. But I guarantee if you look at a process like internal family systems, it's going to move much more quickly. You're going to be ready for a greater depth of practice much more authentically. Now the question might arise, do you need to have a counselor who is on the spiritual path for this to happen? Well, it might help, but it's not necessary. For example, the two people that I've worked with exploring this, they knew what I did. They knew what my vocation was. They knew I was a meditation teacher, but we didn't really have to get into it. I would just share, these are the things that come up, and then using their training, they would help guide me to figure out how to resolve or work with these different parts. And that alone allowed my meditation to deepen. And there may be other ways of exploring this. For example, healing your inner child and your inner parts. That's not really a new thing. That's not specific to internal family systems. We also know in other traditions there are shamanic approaches to soul retrieval and so on. So the ideas that we're talking about with internal family systems, they are not necessarily novel, but for our current age, for our current time, they are extremely effective. And ultimately, this whole process of yoga is about what? Self-realization, realizing the self, recognizing the self, living from the self. And one of the core principles of IFS is being self-led, trusting in the self, being guided by this presence, which is our essence. So while this might not be necessary for you, it could be something worth exploring to help encourage your natural ability to increase your reserves of inner energy so that you can experience samadhi, so that you can experience this oneness with your essence of being. And then eventually, as this inner peace becomes more and more obvious to you, you might stumble upon the fact that there's an ocean of spirit, of divinity all around. And you can simply abide in it, commune with it. You can even converse with it. You then recognize that this ocean of spirit, which you couldn't notice before because there was just so much noise going on in the field of your consciousness, in this ocean of spirit, that your spiritual practices become like a ship that can sail on this sea. And all the skill that you've developed through mantra, through pranayama, through prayer, allow you to navigate this ocean of spirit with certainty, with confidence, and with joy. And now your spiritual practice, your spiritual life isn't about just managing the anxiety you can't get rid of, the depression that comes and goes, or any other bits that need managed. It becomes more about being alive, living fully. And the living is centered in a living, breathing reality of spirit. It's not that you never experience hardship. It's not that there aren't obstacles that come your way, but those hardships and those obstacles just become part of the adventure of your life. You recognize that you are resilient, that you are strong. Often we procrastinate, or we don't want to do things, or we feel overwhelmed, or we think, why do we have to do all of this work in the first place? The reason all of that's there is because there are parts which are struggling. And so once those parts have a momentum and a coherence, then just like in the adventures that you read, the fantasy novels that you read, where the whole process is really part of the experience, you don't need to procrastinate anymore. You don't feel necessarily pathologically overwhelmed anymore. You recognize, in a sense, that you are the spiritual hero in your own story. And we're not trying to encourage a sense of egotism here by calling you a hero, but you recognize that you do have a capacity to behave in life in a very helpful, uplifting, nurturing, inspired, and enthusiastic way. So can you imagine living that way? And those of you who are living that way, that's wonderful. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you're struggling, if you've been meditating for a long time, my sense is you might find, if you explore this process of psychological growth, of psychological integration, of psychological well-being, it becomes a lot easier for you. And one of the most important techniques I have found, one of the most important processes I have found to assist that is the internal family systems process. So consider reading that book by Richard Schwartz, No Bad Parts. I personally really liked the audio book because I could use the guided meditations, which Richard Schwartz reads. Also, you might need to invest in finding an IFS therapist, someone who is trained and certified in the process. I wish I could help you out there. I had actually looked into becoming an IFS certified therapist, but I didn't feel like going back to school to get my master's degree. But I've studied a lot on my own, and I found it to be extremely helpful. So there are people out there that can help you with this. And then you can come back to me. You can come back to the Kriya Yoga online ashram and apply the techniques that we know, and you're going to find that they work even better than you're currently experiencing right now. So I hope I've encouraged you to consider this a little bit more. I have touched on these topics previously in episode 95 of the Kriya Yoga Podcast, Healing Blockages of the Heart Chakra. And we also discussed something similar with David McGraw in episode 202, Spiritual Counseling, Spiritual Practice. So you might want to refer back to those episodes. All right, that should do it for today. I hope this helps you walk your spiritual path with greater inspiration, and I hope it improves your capacity to experience this sense of divine communion. Let me know how it goes in the comments section. Now, a few announcements. Even though it's early in January, many of our retreats are currently filling up. If you are interested in joining us at the Himalayan Institute in Honesdale, Pennsylvania in June for the Kriya Yoga and the Sacred Fire Solstice Retreat, please contact us soon. You can get more information at kriyayogaonline.com. You can go to the events page and you can register there. Also, our Patreon community, Kriya Yoga Online, we are currently doing a series of monthly classes that help to prepare one for samadhi. We're focusing on the Chitta Prasadhanam Sutras and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And we're looking at each one of these sutras individually. And each monthly class, we have a guided meditation to help you understand the sutra more fully. So if you'd like to participate in that monthly lesson series on the Chitta Prasadhanam Sutras, or you'd simply like to help support this podcast, the Kriya Yoga Podcast, you can join us at patreon.com/Kriya Yoga. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast. To learn more about Kriya Yoga meditation, you can visit us at kriyayogaonline.com, where you can find information about current book releases, online classes, and in-person retreats throughout the year. If you're interested in supporting this podcast, visit us at the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community at patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.
Namaha